Picture this. You've dedicated your life to healing, not harming. Your hands have saved countless lives, pulled soldiers back from death's door, and your medical bag is your most trusted weapon. You've sworn an oath to do no harm. And for 3 years in a war-torn country, you've kept that promise sacred. The Geneva Convention protects you. Your Red Cross armband makes you untouchable. You're a medic, you don't fight. But what happens when the rules of war crumble around you? When the enemy doesn't care about your protected status? When it's not just your life on the line, but the lives of wounded soldiers who depend on you to get them home alive? This is the story of Sara Martinez, a 26-year-old Army medic whose world turned upside down in a matter of seconds. One moment she was tending to a wounded comrade. The next she was forced to make a choice that would haunt her forever: stick to her medical oath and watch her fellow soldiers die, or pick up a rifle and become the very thing she swore never to be: a killer. Sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't drawn in black and white. Sometimes it's drawn in blood, dirt, and the desperate cries of those who need you most. This is that story, raw, unfiltered, and absolutely true. Sara Martinez never imagined herself in uniform. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her father work as a paramedic and knew she wanted to help people. But the military seemed like a world away from her quiet life. That changed on a Tuesday morning in her sophomore year of nursing school when everything fell apart. Her younger brother Miguel had been deployed to Afghanistan 6 months earlier. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, the kind of call that changes everything. Miguel had stepped on an improvised explosive device while on patrol. He survived, but barely. Sara spent weeks at his bedside in the military hospital, watching the medics and nurses work tirelessly to save not just Miguel, but dozens of other wounded soldiers who came through those doors every day. It was there, in that sterile hospital corridor, that Sara met Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh. Walsh was a combat medic who had been wounded in the same attack that injured Miguel. As Sara sat by her brother's bedside, Walsh would stop by to check on the new patients, despite her own injuries. Walsh walked with a limp and had a long scar running down her left arm, but she moved with purpose and determination that Sara had never seen before. "Your brother's going to be fine," Walsh told Sara one evening as they both sat in the waiting area. "These docs are the best in the world, and he's tougher than he looks." Sara looked at this woman who couldn't have been much older than herself, yet carried herself with the weight of experience that seemed far beyond her years. "How do you do it?" Sara asked. "How do you see all this pain and keep going?" Walsh was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. "Because for every Miguel we save, there's a family back home that gets to hug their son again. There's a mom who doesn't have to bury her child. There's a sister who gets to argue with her brother about stupid stuff for the rest of their lives." Those words stayed with Sara long after Miguel recovered and returned home. She finished nursing school, but the comfortable life she had planned, working in a local hospital, maybe getting married to her college boyfriend David, settling down in the same town where she grew up, suddenly felt too small. 6 months later, Sara walked into an Army recruiting station. The recruiter, a friendly sergeant named Thompson, looked surprised when she told him she wanted to be a combat medic. "Most people come in here wanting to be infantry or military police," Thompson said, shuffling through paperwork. "Not many young women ask specifically for medical corps, especially not combat medic training." "I know what I want," Sara replied firmly. "I want to help soldiers in the field. I want to be where the need is greatest." Thompson studied her for a moment. "You understand what you're signing up for? Combat medics see some of the worst situations imaginable. You'll be treating gunshot wounds, blast injuries, trauma that would make experienced doctors sick to their stomachs. And you'll be doing it while people are shooting at you." Sara thought about Miguel lying in that hospital bed, about Walsh limping through corridors to comfort other patients despite her own pain. "I understand." Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was unlike anything Sara had experienced. The physical demands were crushing: endless runs, obstacle courses, and training exercises that pushed her body to its limits. But it was the medical training that truly challenged her mind and spirit. In the classroom, instructors taught them about battlefield triage, how to quickly assess multiple casualties and decide who could be saved and who was beyond help. They learned to insert breathing tubes in under 30 seconds, how to stop massive bleeding with tourniquets and pressure dressings, and how to administer life-saving medications while under extreme stress. But the real education came in the field exercises. Instructors would create mock battlefield scenarios using special effects makeup and fake blood that looked terrifyingly real. Sarah would crawl through mud and dirt while instructors fired blanks and set off explosions around them, simulating the chaos of actual combat. "You have 3 casualties," an instructor would shout over the sound of gunfire. "One with a sucking chest wound, one with a severed artery in his leg, and one who's unconscious with possible head trauma. You have 2 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrive. What do you do?" At first, Sarah froze. The scenarios were so realistic, so overwhelming, that her mind would go blank. But gradually, with repetition and practice, something clicked. Her training took over, and she learned to compartmentalize the chaos around her, focusing only on the medical task at hand. Her drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was a former combat medic who had served 3 tours in Iraq. He was tough on all the recruits, but he seemed to pay special attention to Sarah. After one particularly difficult exercise where Sarah had successfully treated 4 mock casualties while under simulated fire, Rodriguez pulled her aside. "Martinez," he said, his voice serious. "You've got something special. Most people break under pressure. You get calmer. That's not something we can teach. You either have it or you don't." "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied, unsure how to respond to the unexpected praise. "Don't thank me yet," Rodriguez continued. "Having that kind of composure is what will keep you and your soldiers alive downrange. But it also means you'll see things that will stay with you forever. You sure you're ready for that?" Sarah thought about her brother, about Walsh, about all the soldiers she might be able to help. "I'm ready, Sergeant." After basic training came advanced individual training, where Sarah learned the more complex medical procedures that might save lives in combat. She learned to perform emergency surgery in field conditions, how to manage multiple trauma patients simultaneously, and how to work with helicopter evacuation teams to get critically wounded soldiers to higher levels of care. The training was intense and comprehensive, but Sarah excelled. She graduated near the top of her class and received orders for her first assignment, Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where she would be attached to the 82nd Airborne Division. At Fort Bragg, Sarah joined Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion. The company was scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan in 6 months, which gave Sarah time to integrate with the unit and continue her training. She was assigned to work with Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan, a veteran medic who had already completed 2 combat tours. Sullivan was a big man with graying hair at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who had learned to find humor even in dark situations. He took Sarah under his wing immediately, teaching her not just the technical aspects of combat medicine, but the psychological and emotional challenges she would face. "The hardest part isn't learning to save lives," Sullivan told her one afternoon as they practiced medical procedures in the Unit 8 station. "It's learning to live with the ones you can't save." Sarah worked with Sullivan for months, absorbing everything he could teach her. She learned about the soldiers in her unit, memorizing not just their names and blood types, but their personalities, their fears, their families back home. Private Johnson from Ohio, who carried pictures of his twin daughters in his helmet. Sergeant Williams from Detroit, who was studying for his college degree during his free time. Corporal Davis from California, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations. These weren't just soldiers to Sarah, they were her responsibility. If any of them got hurt, it would be her job to bring them home alive. As deployment approached, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She had trained for this moment for over a year, but she knew that all the training in the world couldn't fully prepare her for the reality of combat. The night before they left for Afghanistan, she called her family. "I'm proud of you, Mija," her father said over the phone. "But promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come home." "I promise, Dad," Sarah replied, though she knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. Miguel, now fully recovered and back to his old self, was characteristically blunt. "Don't be a hero, Sarah. Do your job, but don't be a hero. Heroes get dead." Sarah laughed, but she understood what her brother was really saying. He was worried about her, just as she had worried about him. The flight to Afghanistan took 18 hours with refueling stops. Sarah spent most of the time reading medical journals and reviewing trauma protocols, trying to keep her mind occupied. But as the plane descended toward Bagram Airfield, reality hit her. She was really doing this. In a matter of hours, she would be in a war zone, responsible for keeping soldiers alive in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The landscape below looked alien and hostile, brown mountains stretching to the horizon, with scattered villages and compounds that could hide enemy fighters. This would be her home for the next 12 months, and somewhere in those mountains and valleys, people would be trying to kill her, and the soldiers she was sworn to protect. Sullivan, sitting beside her, noticed her nervous energy. "You ready for this, Martinez?" Sarah looked out the window one more time, then turned to face her mentor with determination in her eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be, Sergeant." But as the plane touched down on the runway at Bagram, Sarah had no idea that in just 3 weeks, she would face a situation that would test everything she believed about herself, about medicine, and about the thin line between healing and harming that she had sworn never to cross. The heat hit Sarah like a physical wall as she stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Airfield. Even at 6 in the morning, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day in Afghanistan. The air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel, and in the distance, she could hear the steady thrum of helicopters taking off and landing. Her first few days at Bagram were a whirlwind of briefings, equipment checks, and acclimatization training. Sarah learned about the specific threats in their area of operations, the locations of nearby medical facilities, and the protocols for medical evacuation by helicopter. She was assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman, a smaller outpost about 40 miles northeast of Bagram, where Charlie Company would be conducting patrol operations in the surrounding villages. The ride to FOB Chapman in an armored vehicle was Sarah's first real taste of the constant tension that defined life in Afghanistan. The road was dusty and rutted, winding through terrain that offered countless hiding spots for enemy fighters. Every pile of rocks, every abandoned building, every section of road could conceal an improvised explosive device or an ambush position. Sergeant First Class Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, was their vehicle commander. He had been in Afghanistan for 8 months and knew the roads well. As they drove, he pointed out landmarks and potential danger areas. "See that compound up ahead?" Martinez said, pointing to a cluster of mud brick buildings. "Last month, we took fire from there during a patrol. Could be friendly now, could still be hostile. In this country, you never really know." Sarah absorbed every detail, understanding that this knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for her and her soldiers. The landscape was beautiful in its own harsh way. Rugged mountains rose in every direction, and ancient terraces carved into the hillside spoke of generations of farmers who had worked this difficult land. But beneath the beauty lay constant danger. FOB Chapman was a small base surrounded by concrete walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by soldiers who scanned the surrounding terrain through high-powered scopes. Inside the walls, the base was a collection of prefabricated buildings, tents, and shipping containers that had been converted into living and working spaces. Sarah's medical aid station was housed in a reinforced concrete building near the center of the base. It was well equipped with modern medical supplies, surgical instruments, and communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate with helicopter evacuation teams and higher-level medical facilities. Sullivan showed her around the facility, explaining the layout and the procedures they would follow for different types of casualties. "This is where we'll bring the walking wounded," Sullivan said, gesturing to one section of the aid station. "Over here is for critical cases that need immediate surgery or stabilization before evacuation. And this," he pointed to a separate area, "is where we'll bring soldiers who don't make it." Sarah nodded, trying to push down the anxiety that rose in her chest. She had trained for this, but the reality of being responsible for soldiers' lives in combat was more daunting than any classroom exercise. Her first week at FOB Chapman was relatively quiet. Charlie Company conducted several routine patrols in the nearby villages, and Sarah accompanied them to get familiar with the terrain and the local population. The villagers were mostly friendly, but cautious, clearly walking a fine line between cooperating with American forces and avoiding retribution from Taliban fighters who operated in the area. During these patrols, Sarah treated minor injuries, cuts, and scrapes from navigating rough terrain, heat exhaustion from soldiers who hadn't yet adjusted to the climate, and the occasional stomach bug that seemed to affect everyone who spent time in country. These were routine medical issues that she handled easily, building confidence in both her abilities and her relationship with the soldiers she served. Private Johnson, the soldier from Ohio with twin daughters, was particularly grateful when Sarah treated a badly infected cut on his hand that had been bothering him for days. "Doc, you're a lifesaver," he said as Sarah cleaned and bandaged the wound. "I was starting to think I might lose a finger." "Just keep it clean and dry," Sarah replied, handing him extra bandages. "And Come see me if it doesn't start looking better in a couple of days. These interactions helped Sarah build the trust and rapport with her soldiers that would be crucial if they faced serious casualties. She learned their individual medical histories, their concerns about injuries or health issues, and their families back home. This personal knowledge would help her provide better care under stress, but it also meant that each soldier became more than just a patient. They became someone she cared about personally. 2 weeks into her deployment, Charlie Company received orders for a more ambitious mission. Intelligence reports suggested that a high-value Taliban target was operating out of a compound in a village called Khair Bagh, about 15 miles from FOB Chapman. The mission would involve a night raid to capture or kill the target and gather intelligence about Taliban operations in the region. Captain Williams, the company commander, briefed the platoon leaders and key personnel, including Sarah, about the mission details. The plan was straightforward. 2 platoons would establish a cordon around the village while a 3rd platoon, accompanied by Afghan National Army soldiers, would assault the target compound. Intelligence indicates there may be 15 to 20 enemy fighters in the area, Captain Williams explained, pointing to a map of the village. We expect moderate resistance, but we need to be prepared for anything. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the location of the target compound, potential landing zones for medical evacuation helicopters, and the routes that wounded soldiers would need to take to reach her position. She coordinated with the helicopter crews that would be on standby for medical evacuation, ensuring they understood the plan and could respond quickly if needed. The night before the mission, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot, going over medical procedures in her mind and thinking about the soldiers who would be counting on her if things went wrong. Sullivan noticed her restlessness and sat down beside her bunk. First big mission is always nerve-wracking, he said quietly. You know what you're doing, Martinez. Trust your training. What if I mess up? Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her all day. What if someone gets hurt and I can't save them? Sullivan was quiet for a moment before responding. You're going to save a lot of people in this deployment, but you're also going to lose some. That's the hardest truth about this job. You can do everything right, follow every protocol perfectly, and sometimes it still won't be enough. The best medics aren't the ones who never lose a patient. They're the ones who learn from every case and keep fighting to save the next one. His words were both comforting and sobering. Sarah understood that she was about to face the reality of combat medicine in a way that no training could fully prepare her for. The mission began at 2 in the morning. Sarah rode in the command vehicle with Captain Williams and the radio operators, positioned where she could respond quickly to any casualties, but far enough from the action to avoid unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. As they approached the village, Sarah could feel her heart racing, but her mind was clear and focused. The initial assault went smoothly. 3rd Platoon breached the compound and found the target, a Taliban commander responsible for several attacks on coalition forces. They captured him alive along with several associates and a cache of weapons and explosives. For a moment, it seemed like the mission would be a complete success without any casualties. Then, everything changed. As the assault team was preparing to withdraw from the compound, enemy fighters who had been hiding in nearby buildings opened fire. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles split the night air, followed by the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades exploding against the compound walls. Contact! Contact! Came the urgent radio calls from the assault team. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Request immediate support. Sarah could hear the firefight intensifying over the radio, and her medical training kicked in immediately. She began preparing her equipment and coordinating with the helicopter crews for potential medical evacuations. Martinez, get ready, Captain Williams said grimly. Sounds like they're in for a fight. Minutes later, the first casualty call came over the radio. We have 1 urgent surgical, 1 priority. The voice crackled through the static. The caller was using military medical terminology that Sarah understood immediately. 1 soldier with life-threatening injuries who needed surgery to survive, and another with serious but not immediately fatal wounds. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the voice making the call. It was Corporal Davis from California, the soldier who could make anyone laugh. The fact that Davis was calling in casualties meant he wasn't one of the wounded, but it also meant that some of her soldiers were badly hurt. Roger, understood. Sarah responded into her radio. Medical evacuation helicopter is en route. What are the nature of the injuries? Gunshot wound to the chest for the urgent surgical, Davis replied, his voice tight with stress. Priority has shrapnel wounds to the legs and abdomen. We're trying to get them to the extraction point, but we're still taking heavy fire. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Gunshot wound to the chest could mean damage to the heart, lungs, or major blood vessels. Injuries that would be fatal within minutes without immediate treatment. And moving wounded soldiers while under fire was one of the most dangerous situations a combat medic could face. "I'm coming to you," Sarah said into the radio, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Negative," Captain Williams interjected. "Too dangerous. Wait for them to bring the casualties to you." But Sarah was already moving, checking her medical bag, and preparing to leave the relative safety of the command vehicle. Every second counted when dealing with critical injuries, and she knew that the wounded soldiers might not survive the time it took to carry them to her position. "Sir, with respect, that soldier with the chest wound won't make it if I wait," Sarah said firmly. "I need to get to them now." Captain Williams studied her for a moment, clearly torn between wanting to protect his medic and knowing that she was right about the urgency of the situation. Finally, he nodded grimly. "Take Johnson and Williams with you for security," he ordered. "Stay in radio contact, and if the situation gets too hot, you get out of there immediately." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and body armor, her mind already focused on the tasks ahead. She thought about the wounded soldiers waiting for her help, about the training that had prepared her for this moment, and about the oath she had taken to preserve life above all else. As she prepared to leave the safety of the command vehicle and move toward the sound of gunfire, Sarah had no idea that she was about to face a situation that would challenge everything she believed about her role as a medic and force her to make choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The sound of automatic weapons fire grew louder as she moved forward into the darkness, her medical bag bouncing against her back with each step. Somewhere ahead in that chaos of muzzle flashes and explosions, soldiers were dying, and it was her job to bring them home alive. No matter what the cost, Sarah moved through the narrow alleyways of Carebog with Johnson and Williams flanking her, their weapons ready and eyes scanning for threats. The village looked different in the darkness. Shadows seemed to hide enemies behind every corner, and the sound of gunfire echoed off the mud brick walls in a confusing cacophony that made it difficult to determine where the shots were coming from. The radio chatter in her earpiece painted a grim picture of the situation. 3rd Platoon was pinned down in the target compound by enemy fighters positioned in at least 3 different buildings. The wounded soldiers were trapped in the compound courtyard, unable to move to the extraction point while under direct fire. "Doc, this way," Johnson whispered, pointing toward a narrow path between 2 buildings that would take them closer to the compound. Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the distance, and hear the distinctive sound of American M4 rifles returning fire against the enemy AK-47s. As they moved closer to the firefight, Sarah began to hear something that made her blood run cold, someone screaming in pain. The sound was raw and desperate, the kind of cry that comes from someone who has been badly wounded and is fighting to stay alive. Sarah forced herself to focus on her training and pushed down the emotional response that threatened to overwhelm her. They reached a position about 50 meters from the compound where they could see the situation clearly. 3rd Platoon had taken cover behind a low wall in the courtyard, but they were surrounded on 3 sides by enemy positions. Sarah could see 2 figures lying motionless on the ground, the wounded soldiers she had come to help. Sergeant Thompson, the platoon leader, spotted Sarah's team and crawled over to their position. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and Sarah could see the strain of the situation in his eyes. "Doc, thank God you're here," Thompson said urgently. Martinez took one to the chest. "It's bad. He's conscious, but losing a lot of blood." Peterson caught shrapnel from an RPG blast. Both legs and his stomach. "He's in shock, but still talking." Sarah studied the situation carefully. The wounded soldiers were lying in an open area of the courtyard, exposed to fire from multiple directions. Getting to them would mean crossing 15 meters of open ground while enemy fighters were actively shooting at the compound. "Can you provide covering fire?" Sarah asked Thompson. "We'll do what we can," Thompson replied, "but we're low on ammunition, and they've got us pretty well pinned down. The moment you move into that courtyard, you're going to draw fire." Sarah looked at Johnson and Williams, the soldiers who had volunteered to provide her security. Both men were young, probably not much older than herself, but their faces showed determination mixed with understandable fear. "You don't have to come with me," Sarah told them. "This isn't a medical mission anymore. This is about getting to wounded soldiers under fire." Johnson shook his head immediately. Doc, we're not leaving you. That's Martinez out there. He's got kids back home. And Peterson helped me carry my gear when I was sick last week. We're going. Williams nodded in agreement. Besides, someone's got to watch your back while you work on them. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude and pride for these soldiers who were willing to risk their lives to help save their comrades. She checked her medical supplies one more time, ensuring that everything was organized and accessible. She had tourniquets, pressure bandages, chest seals, pain medications, and, for fluids, everything she would need to stabilize critical trauma patients in field conditions. Okay, Sarah said, taking a deep breath. When I give the signal, 3rd Platoon opens up with everything they've got to suppress the enemy positions. We move fast and low across the courtyard. Once we reach the casualties, Johnson and Williams establish security while I work on them. Questions? Both soldiers shook their head. Sarah could see her own nervousness reflected in their faces, but she could also see their determination to complete the mission. Sarah keyed her radio. Thompson, this is Martinez. On my mark, I need maximum suppression on all enemy positions for 30 seconds. We're coming across. Roger, document standing by. Sarah counted to 3 in her head, then spoke into the radio. Mark. Immediately, the soldiers of 3rd Platoon opened fire with everything they had. The sound was deafening. M4 rifles firing on full automatic, machine guns chattering, and grenade launchers thumping as they sent high explosive rounds toward the enemy positions. The volume of fire was so intense that the enemy fighters were forced to take cover, giving Sarah's team the window they needed. Go, 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 Sarah shouted, and all 3 of them sprinted across the open courtyard. Sarah had never run so fast in her life. Her medical bag bounced against her back, her heart pounded in her chest, and she could hear bullets whining past them as some enemy fighters continued to shoot despite the suppressing fire. The 15 meters felt like 15 miles, but, finally, they slid to safety behind a low wall where the wounded soldiers lay. Sarah immediately went to work on Martinez, the soldier with the gunshot wound to the chest. He was conscious but pale, and Sarah could see blood soaking through his uniform. She quickly cut away his body armor and shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had entered just below Martinez's left collarbone and exited through his back, missing his heart, but causing significant damage to his left lung. Sarah could tell immediately that the lung had collapsed. Martinez was struggling to breathe, and the left side of his chest wasn't rising and falling normally. Martinez, stay with me, Sarah said as she worked. You're going to be okay, but I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me. Sarah quickly applied a chest seal over the entrance wound to prevent air from continuing to enter the chest cavity, then rolled Martinez onto his side to seal the exit wound on his back. She then prepared to decompress the collapsed lung using a large-bore needle inserted between the ribs. This was a procedure Sarah had practiced dozens of times in training, but never on a real patient under combat conditions. As she positioned the needle, enemy fire began to intensify again. Bullets struck the wall above their heads, sending chips of concrete raining down on them. Doc, they're massing for another attack, Williams called out urgently. We need to move these guys soon. Sarah ignored the gunfire and focused on the medical procedure. She inserted the needle into Martinez's chest cavity and immediately heard the hiss of air escaping, confirmation that the lung had been collapsed and was now beginning to reinflate. Martinez's breathing immediately improved, and some color returned to his face. Thanks, Doc, he gasped. I couldn't breathe there for a minute. Sarah quickly started in 4-line in Martinez's arm and began administering fluids and pain medication. She then moved to Peterson, who had multiple shrapnel wounds from the RPG blast. Peterson was conscious, but clearly in shock from blood loss and pain. His legs were badly damaged. Sarah could see bone fragments and torn muscle tissue, and he had several pieces of metal embedded in his abdomen. The abdominal wounds were particularly concerning because they could involve damage to internal organs. Peterson, how are you feeling? Sarah asked as she began assessing his injuries. Like I got hit by a truck, Peterson replied weakly. My legs are on fire, document. Sarah quickly applied tourniquets to both of Peterson's legs to control the bleeding, then began examining his abdominal wounds. She was relieved to find that the shrapnel had penetrated the muscle wall, but didn't appear to have damaged any vital organs. She irrigated the wounds and applied pressure dressings. As Sarah worked on Peterson, she became aware that the gunfire around them was intensifying. Enemy fighters were moving closer to their position, and she could hear Thompson shouting orders to his soldiers as they tried to hold their defensive perimeter. "Doc, we've got movement in the building to our north," Johnson called out. "Looks like they're trying to flank us." Sarah finished stabilizing Peterson's wounds and started a second four-line. Both casualties were now stable enough for transport, but moving them while under fire would be extremely dangerous. "Thompson," Sarah called out, "my patients are ready for evacuation, but I need a secure route to the extraction point." "Working on it, Doc," Thompson replied, "but we're taking fire from 3 directions now. They've got us surrounded." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the gravity of their situation. They were trapped in the compound with 2 critically wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical evacuation, but enemy fighters had cut off their escape routes. The helicopter that was supposed to evacuate the casualties couldn't land while the area was under fire. Suddenly, a new voice came over the radio, Captain Williams calling from the command post. "All 3rd Platoon elements, this is actual. We have close air support inbound in 5 minutes. F-16s with guided missiles. I need you to mark target buildings with smoke and take cover immediately." Sarah felt a surge of relief. Close air support would eliminate the enemy positions and allow them to evacuate the wounded soldiers. But 5 minutes was a long time when under direct fire, and she wasn't sure they could hold their position that long. As if reading her thoughts, Thompson crawled over to their position. "Doc, we're running low on ammunition, and they're getting closer. I don't think we can hold for 5 more minutes." Sarah looked at her 2 patients. Martinez was stable, but would need surgery within the next hour to repair the damage to his lung. Peterson was also stable, but had lost a significant amount of blood and needed blood transfusions and possible surgery for his leg wounds. "We need to get them out of here now," Sarah said. "Can we make it to the extraction point?" Thompson shook his head. "They've got machine gun positions covering the route. Anyone who tries to cross that open ground is going to get cut down." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. 2 soldiers' lives depended on her decisions, and every option seemed to lead to disaster. If they stayed, they might all be overrun before air support arrived. If they tried to move, the casualties might be killed during the evacuation attempt. As she wrestled with these impossible choices, Sarah heard a sound that made her heart sink, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Someone among the enemy fighters had managed to set up a mortar position, and they were about to rain explosive shells down on the compound. "Incoming," Thompson shouted, and everyone pressed themselves against the ground as the first mortar round exploded nearby, sending dirt and debris flying through the air. Sarah threw herself over Martinez to protect him from the shrapnel, feeling the concussion of the explosion in her chest. When she looked up, she saw something that would change everything. Enemy fighters moving through the breach in the compound wall that had been created by the mortar blast. They were about to be overrun, and Sarah had 2 critically wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. In that moment, with bullets flying around her and enemy fighters advancing on their position, Sarah faced a choice that would haunt her forever. On the ground beside Peterson lay an M4 rifle, dropped by a soldier who had been killed earlier in the firefight. Sarah looked at the weapon, then at her wounded patients, then at the advancing enemy fighters. Everything she had been taught as a medic told her that her job was to heal, not to harm. The Geneva Convention protected medical personnel and prohibited them from engaging in combat. But as she watched enemy fighters moving toward her wounded soldiers with weapons raised, Sarah realized that sometimes the line between healing and harming wasn't as clear as she had thought. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she could hear enemy fighters shouting in local dialect as they advanced through the compound. In a few more seconds, they would reach her position, and her wounded soldiers would be defenseless. Sarah reached for the rifle. Sarah's hand trembled as she picked up the M4 rifle. The weapon felt alien in her hands, cold, heavy, and somehow wrong. For 18 months, she had trained with weapons as required by the Army, but always with the understanding that her role was to preserve life, not take it. Her medical bag, filled with instruments of healing, sat beside her as she gripped this instrument of death. Martinez, despite his injuries, noticed what she was doing. "Doc, no," he whispered urgently. "You can't. You're a medic." But Sarah could see the enemy fighters advancing through the breach in the compound wall. There were at least 6 of them, armed with AK-47 rifles and moving with the confidence of fighters who believed they had their enemies trapped. Behind Sarah, Johnson and Williams were engaged in a desperate firefight with other enemy positions. unable to turn their attention to this new threat. "Doc," Peterson gasped, his voice weak from blood loss, but his eyes alert. "Behind you." Sarah turned to see an enemy fighter who had flanked around the wall and was now less than 20 meters away, his rifle raised and aimed directly at her and her patients. Time seemed to slow as Sarah realized that she had perhaps 2 seconds before the fighter opened fire. Every instinct she had developed as a medic screamed at her to drop the weapon and raise her hands, to show her Red Cross armband, and claim protection under the Geneva Convention. But she also knew, with crystal clarity, that the enemy fighter advancing on their position wasn't going to honor any conventions. He was going to kill her, and then execute her wounded patients where they lay. Sarah raised the M4 rifle and fired. The sound of the gunshot seemed impossibly loud in her ears. The enemy fighter stumbled backward and fell, his own weapon clattering across the stone floor of the compound. Sarah stared at what she had done, her mind struggling to process the fact that she, a person sworn to preserve life, had just taken one. "Good shot, Doc," Johnson called out, apparently unaware of the moral crisis Sarah was experiencing. "There's more coming through the breach." Sarah looked and saw that Johnson was right. More enemy fighters were pouring through the opening in the wall, and the remaining soldiers of 3rd Platoon were being overwhelmed. Thompson was shouting orders, trying to reorganize his men's defense, but they were outnumbered and running out of ammunition. Sarah found herself in a surreal situation. She was crouched behind a wall with a smoking rifle in her hands, 2 critically wounded soldiers depending on her for medical care, and more enemy fighters advancing on their position. Every part of her training as a medic told her to put down the weapon and focus on her patients. But every part of her training as a soldier told her that if she didn't continue fighting, all 3 of them would be dead within minutes. "Martinez, how are you feeling?" Sarah asked as she checked his 4-line with one hand, while keeping her rifle ready with the other. "Better," Martinez replied, though his voice was still weak. "The chest doesn't hurt as much. But, Doc, you need to get out of here. This position is going to be overrun." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that moving 2 critically wounded soldiers under fire was almost impossible. Martinez might be able to walk with assistance, but Peterson couldn't move his legs and would need to be carried. And carrying wounded soldiers while under fire required multiple people, more than they currently had available. Another mortar round exploded nearby, this one closer than the last. Dirt and debris rained down on them, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of more rounds incoming. The enemy had their position ranged, and it was only a matter of time before one of the mortar rounds scored a direct hit. "We have to move," Sarah said, making the decision that she knew could kill them all. "Johnson, Williams, we need to carry these casualties to the extraction point now." Both soldiers immediately broke off from their defensive positions and crawled over to Sarah's location. Williams took one look at the rifle in Sarah's hands and the body of the enemy fighter she had killed, but said nothing. There would be time for questions later, if any of them survived. "Peterson can't walk," Sarah explained quickly. "We'll need to carry him. Martinez might be able to move with assistance, but I don't want to stress his lung injury." Johnson nodded grimly. "Where's the extraction point?" Thompson, who had been listening to their radio traffic, crawled over to join them. "About 100 meters to the south," he said. "Open ground for the first 50 meters, then some cover behind a grove of trees. But there's a machine gun position covering that route. Soon as we move into the open, they'll cut us down." Sarah considered their options. They could wait for the close air support that was supposedly en route, but the mortar fire was getting more accurate, and she wasn't sure her patients could survive much longer without getting to a hospital. They could try to move under cover of darkness, but dawn was approaching, and they would soon lose that advantage. As she weighed these impossible choices, Sarah heard a new sound that made her heart leap with hope, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors in the distance. The medical evacuation helicopter was approaching, but it couldn't land while the area was under fire. "This is Medevac 7-3, a voice crackled over the radio. "I have your position in sight, but I'm taking fire from multiple locations. I can't land until you suppress those enemy positions." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. They needed the helicopter to evacuate her casualties, but the helicopter couldn't land until they eliminated the threats. And they couldn't eliminate the threats because they were pinned down and outnumbered. That's when Thompson made a decision that would save their lives, but cost him his own. "Doc, take Johnson and Williams and get those casualties to the extraction point," Thompson ordered. "My guys and I will provide covering fire and try to take out that machine gun position. Sarah understood immediately what Thompson was proposing. He was asking his remaining soldiers to make what would likely be a suicide charge against a fortified enemy position in order to create a window for the medical evacuation. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was their only option. Thompson, that's suicide, Sarah protested. You'll all be killed. Thompson's face was grim, but determined. Maybe, but if we don't try, we're all dead anyway. And those boys, he gestured to Martinez and Peterson, have families back home who are counting on them coming back alive. Before Sarah could argue further, Thompson was already moving, calling out to his remaining soldiers and preparing for their desperate assault. Sarah realized that she had perhaps 30 seconds to get her patients ready for movement before Thompson's diversionary attack began. Johnson, you take Peterson's feet, Sarah ordered. Williams, grab his shoulders. I'll carry the medical equipment and provide security. As they prepared to move Peterson, Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. She slung the M4 rifle across her back alongside her medical bag. She was now carrying the tools of both healing and killing, and she might need to use either one before this night was over. Ready? Sarah asked. Johnson and Williams nodded, their faces set with determination. Thompson's voice came over the radio one last time. All elements, this is Thompson. On my mark, we move. Doc, you get those boys home safe. Roger, Sarah replied, her throat tight with emotion. Thank you, Thompson. Mark, Thompson and his soldiers charged toward the machine gun position with weapons firing. The sound was deafening, automatic weapons fire, explosions, and the shouts of men in combat. Sarah didn't look back as she and her team began moving toward the extraction point, carrying Peterson between them while Martinez stumbled along beside them, supported by sheer determination. The first 50 meters were the longest of Sarah's life. They moved across open ground while gunfire erupted all around them. She could hear bullets snapping past them and felt the heat of tracers burning through the air. Peterson, despite his pain and blood loss, remained conscious and actually tried to help by using his arms to support some of his own weight. Almost there, Sarah gasped as they approached the tree line that would provide cover. Behind them, she could still hear the sound of Thompson's assault, but the volume of fire was diminishing in a way that suggested the outcome. They reached the cover of the trees just as the medical evacuation helicopter began its approach to the landing zone. Sarah quickly checked both of her patients' vital signs and, for lines, ensuring that they were stable enough for transport. Martinez was conscious and alert, his breathing improved since Sarah had decompressed his collapsed lung. Peterson was weak from blood loss, but stable, and his bleeding was controlled by the tourniquets and pressure dressings Sarah had applied. As the helicopter touched down, sending up clouds of dust and debris, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that her patients would soon receive the hospital care they needed. Grief for Thompson and his soldiers, who had sacrificed their lives to make this evacuation possible. And a deep uncertainty about what she had become during this night of violence. The helicopter crew chief and flight medic quickly loaded Peterson and Martinez onto stretchers and into the aircraft. Sarah provided a rapid medical briefing, updating the flight medic on the injuries and treatment she had provided. Good work, Doc, the flight medic shouted over the noise of the rotors. You saved their lives tonight. As the helicopter lifted off into the dawn sky, Sarah stood in the landing zone with Johnson and Williams, watching their wounded comrades disappear into the distance. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that seemed almost obscene after the darkness and violence of the night. Sarah became aware that she was still carrying the M4 rifle along with her medical bag. She looked down at the weapon, remembering the moment when she had fired it, remembering the enemy fighter falling to the ground. She had become something she had never intended to be, a killer as well as a healer. Johnson seemed to sense her distress. Doc, you did what you had to do, he said quietly. Those fighters would have killed all of us if you hadn't acted. Sarah nodded, but she knew that understanding the necessity of her actions and living with them were two very different things. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and she wasn't sure what that meant for her future as a medic or as a person. The radio crackled with updates from the close air support mission. The F-16s had finally arrived and were engaging the remaining enemy positions with guided missiles. Thompson and his soldiers had succeeded in their mission, The machine gun position had been destroyed, though at the cost of their own lives. As Sarah walked back toward the compound to help search for survivors and tend to any additional casualties, she realized that this night had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She was still a medic, still committed to saving lives, but she was no longer the idealistic young woman who had enlisted with clear notions about the difference between healers and warriors. The war had made her something more complex, something harder to define. And, as she approached the compound where Thompson and his soldiers lay dead, Sarah wondered if she would ever be able to reconcile the person she had been with the person she had become. The investigation began 3 days after the firefight at Karbach. Sarah sat in a sterile office at Bagram Airfield, facing a panel of officers who would determine whether her actions that night had violated the Geneva Convention and military regulations governing medical personnel in combat. Colonel Richardson, the investigating officer, was a career soldier with sharp eyes and a demeanor that gave nothing away. Beside him sat Major Santos, a military lawyer, and Captain Mitchell from the Inspector General's office. They had been asking questions for over an hour, going over every detail of that night with the methodical precision of people whose job was to find the truth. Specialist Martinez, Colonel Richardson said, consulting his notes. Let's go over the sequence of events one more time. At what point did you first handle a weapon during the engagement? Sarah had told this story dozens of times over the past 3 days, to her commanding officers, to military investigators, to a psychiatrist who was evaluating her psychological fitness for duty. Each time, she tried to convey not just what had happened, but why she had made the choices she made. Sir, I picked up the rifle when I observed enemy fighters advancing on my patient's position, Sarah replied. Private Johnson and Corporal Williams were engaged with other enemy elements and couldn't provide security for the casualties. I assessed that the enemy fighters posed an immediate threat to my patient's lives. Major Santos leaned forward. And your first thought wasn't to signal your medical status? To attempt to claim protection under the Geneva Convention? Sarah had struggled with this question herself over the past 3 days. In the chaos of that moment, claiming protected status had never even occurred to her. All she had seen were enemy fighters moving toward wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. No, sir, Sarah answered honestly. My assessment was that the enemy combatants were not observing Geneva Convention protocols. They were advancing on wounded soldiers in a manner that suggested they intended to kill them regardless of their status as non-combatants. Colonel Richardson studied Sarah for a long moment. Specialist Martinez, in your medical training, you took an oath to do no harm. How do you reconcile that oath with your actions during this engagement? This was the question that had been haunting Sarah since that night. She had thought about it constantly, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle with no clear solution. Finally, she had come to an understanding that she tried to articulate to the panel. Sir, I believe that allowing my patients to be killed when I had the means to prevent it would have been a greater violation of my oath than using force to protect them, Sarah said. My primary duty as a medic is to preserve life. That night, the only way to preserve the lives of my patients was to engage the enemy. The questioning continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the engagement. Sarah learned that Martinez and Peterson had both survived their injuries and were recovering at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Martinez would make a full recovery and return to duty, though he would be transferred to a non-combat role. Peterson would require multiple surgeries to repair his leg injuries, but doctors expected him to walk again. Thompson and 3 of his soldiers had been killed in their assault on the enemy machine gun position. Their sacrifice had made the medical evacuation possible and had ultimately saved the lives of not just Martinez and Peterson, but several other soldiers who had been wounded during the engagement. When the formal questioning was over, Colonel Richardson asked Sarah to remain behind while the other officers left the room. She sat nervously, unsure what to expect. Martinez, the colonel said when they were alone, I've been in the army for 24 years. I've seen combat in 3 different wars, and I've investigated dozens of incidents where soldiers had to make split-second decisions under extreme stress. Sarah waited, unsure where this was leading. What you did that night saved lives, Richardson continued. But it also put you in an impossible position. The regulations regarding medical personnel in combat are clear, but they were written by people who never found themselves watching enemy fighters advance on wounded soldiers they were responsible for protecting. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Sir, does that mean? It means the investigation is closed, Richardson said. No charges will be filed. Your actions were within the bounds of self-defense and defensive patients under your care. However, he paused, given the psychological impact of these events, you're being reassigned to the rear aid station at Bagram. No more frontline missions. Sarah felt conflicted about this news. Part of her was relieved that she wouldn't have to face similar situations again. But another part of her, the part that had chosen to become a combat medic, felt like she was being punished for doing what was necessary to save lives. Sir, if I may ask, Sarah said, is this reassignment because of my actions during the engagement? Colonel Richardson shook his head. It's because of what those actions cost you. The psychiatrist's report indicates that you're struggling with what happened that night. You've been having nightmares, difficulty sleeping, problems concentrating. These are normal responses to traumatic events, but they could put you and others at risk in future combat situations. Sarah knew he was right. She had been having nightmares almost every night since the engagement. Dreams where she relived the moment of pulling the trigger, where she saw the enemy fighter falling, where she heard Thompson's last radio transmission. During the day, she found herself constantly checking and rechecking her medical procedures, second-guessing every decision. The medics at the rear aid station do important work, Richardson added. You'll be treating wounded soldiers who are evacuated from forward positions, preparing them for transport to higher levels of care. It's still saving lives, Martinez, just from a different position. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into her new role at the Bagram aid station. The work was challenging and rewarding. She treated everything from routine injuries and illnesses to critical trauma cases that came in by helicopter from forward operating bases throughout the region. She worked alongside experienced medics and doctors who had seen their share of combat and understood the psychological toll it could take. Dr. Williams, the chief medical officer at the aid station, took a particular interest in Sarah's adjustment to her new role. You know, Dr. Williams told her one day as they worked on a soldier who had been wounded by an improvised explosive device, the ability to make hard choices under pressure is what makes someone a good medic. What happened to you at Karbagh? That kind of situation is every combat medic's worst nightmare. The fact that you were able to act effectively shows that you have what it takes to do this job. Sarah appreciated the encouragement, but she still struggled with what she had become. The other medics at the aid station looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Word had spread about the engagement, and some people seemed to view her as a hero while others seemed unsure what to make of a medic who had killed enemy fighters. 3 months into her assignment at Bagram, Sarah received a letter that would change her perspective on everything that had happened. It was from Martinez's wife, Elena. Dear Sarah, the letter began. I hope you don't mind me writing to you. My husband told me what happened that night in Karbagh, and I wanted you to know how grateful our family is for what you did. Miguel is recovering well, and should be able to come home next month. Our daughters ask about you all the time. They call you the angel who saved their daddy. Sarah had to stop reading for a moment, tears blurring her vision. She had been so focused on the moral complexity of her actions that she had lost sight of the simple fact that 2 soldiers were alive because of what she had done. The letter continued. Miguel told me that you've been struggling with what happened that night. He wanted me to tell you that he doesn't see you as someone who broke an oath or violated your principles. He sees you as someone who understood that sometimes protecting life requires taking life, and who had the courage to do what was necessary. Elena's letter went on to describe how Martinez was dealing with his own psychological aftermath from the engagement. He was receiving counseling for PTSD and working through his own guilt about surviving when Thompson and the others had died. But he was also planning to stay in the army and continue serving as a medic, inspired by Sarah's example. Reading that letter, Sarah began to understand that the person she had become that night wasn't necessarily a contradiction of who she had been before. She was still someone who wanted to heal and protect life. She had just learned that sometimes protecting life required more complex choices than she had ever imagined. 6 months later, Sarah received orders to return to the United States. Her deployment was ending, and she would be stationed at Fort Sam Houston, the same place where she had trained to become a combat medic 2 years earlier. As she packed her gear and prepared to leave Afghanistan, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed. She was no longer the idealistic young woman who had enlisted with clear notions about the difference between healing and harming. The war had taught her that real life was more complicated than textbooks, and training exercises could prepare her for. She had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant making choices that would haunt her forever. On the flight back to the United States, Sarah sat next to Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the same drill sergeant who had trained her at Fort Sam Houston. He was returning from his own deployment and immediately recognized her. "Martinez," Rodriguez said with a smile. "I heard about what happened at Karbagh. Word is you saved some lives that night." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. "I did what I had to do, Sergeant." Rodriguez studied her for a moment. "You know, when you were in training, I told you that you had something special, that you could stay calm under pressure. I also warned you that you'd see things that would stay with you forever." "I remember," Sarah replied. "The thing about carrying difficult memories," Rodriguez continued, "is that they're the price we pay for making a difference. Not everyone can handle that weight. But the people who can, they're the ones who end up saving the most lives." As the plane flew over the Atlantic Ocean, carrying her home from a war that had changed her in ways she was still discovering, Sarah thought about the soldiers she had saved and the choices she had made. She thought about Thompson and his men who had sacrificed their lives so that others could live. She thought about Martinez and Peterson, who were alive and would be returning to their families. Sarah Martinez returned to the United States as someone different from the person who had left. She was no longer just a healer or just a warrior, but something more complex, someone who understood that in a world where evil exists, protecting innocence sometimes requires the courage to act decisively, even when the action contradicts everything you thought you believed about yourself. She would continue her career as a medic, eventually becoming an instructor at Fort Sam Houston, where she would train new combat medics. She would teach them not just about medicine and trauma care, but about the psychological challenges they would face and the difficult moral choices they might have to make. And sometimes, late at night when the nightmares came, Sarah would remember that moment in the compound at Karbagh when she picked up a rifle to protect wounded soldiers who couldn't protect themselves. She would remember the weight of that choice and the lives that were saved because of it. And gradually, over time, she learned to live with the person she had become, not despite the choices she had made, but because of them. Years later, when young medics would ask her about the hardest part of being a combat medic, Sarah would tell them that it wasn't learning to save lives under fire or dealing with traumatic injuries. The hardest part was understanding that sometimes, in order to preserve life, you had to be willing to become something you never thought you could be. Medics don't fight, she would tell them. But sometimes, when everything else fails and lives hang in the balance, a good medic will do whatever it takes to bring their soldiers home alive, even if it changes them forever.